Nashville has always presented itself as the home of country music, the keeper of the tradition, the guardian of the genre. But there is another history, one the industry would prefer you never found. A list of men, from Guy Clark to David Allan Coe, who were too real, too raw, or simply too honest for the machine to contain. Nashville didn't just ignore them, it moved against them. Deliberately, systematically, and in some cases, permanently. These are 10 outlaw country legends Nashville tried to erase. The methods varied, the results never did. Let's count them down. Number 10. Guy Clark. The weapon Nashville used against Guy Clark was the quietest one in the arsenal: indifference. Clark was, by almost universal consensus among his peers, one of the greatest songwriters who ever lived. Artists like Emmylou Harris, Lyle Lovett, and Steve Earle built careers on his compositions. But Nashville's commercial machine had no category for a man who refused to write anything other than the truth. RCA signed him in 1975 and simply failed to promote him. His albums were critically praised and commercially invisible, not because audiences didn't want them, but because the industry never gave them a real chance. Guy Clark died in 2016, having never had a top 10 country hit. Nashville called it a commercial reality. History calls it a scandal. Number 9. Townes Van Zandt. Nashville's weapon against Townes Van Zandt was more aggressive. They mishandled his masters, botched his distribution, and left him without the royalties that should have come from a catalog that defined a generation. His label deals were structured to benefit the industry, not the artist. His albums disappeared from shelves while covers of his songs made other people rich. Poncho and Lefty, co-written by Van Zandt, recorded by Willie Nelson and Merle Haggard, became a #1 hit in 1983. The man who wrote it couldn't afford to pay his rent. Townes Van Zandt died on New Year's Day, 1997, with virtually nothing. The machine had taken everything else. Number 8. Kris Kristofferson. The weapon Nashville used against Kris Kristofferson was categorization. He was a Rhodes Scholar, a helicopter pilot, and a janitor at Columbia Recording Studios who slipped demo tapes to producers between shifts. When his songs became hits for other artists, Nashville was happy to cash the checks. When Kristofferson wanted to perform them himself, the industry froze. He didn't fit the mold. Too literary, too complex, too unpolished for the format country radio demanded. His performing career was relegated to cult status, while lesser writers with smoother edges dominated the charts. Nashville used his words and buried his voice. Number 7. Billy Joe Shaver. Billy Joe Shaver wrote most of the album Waylon Jennings called the record that saved his career, Honky Tonk Heroes, 1973. Shaver walked into that session with 11 original songs. Every single one made the cut. It became one of the defining albums of the Outlaw era. Nashville's response was to hand every award connected to that record to Jennings and pretend Shaver barely existed. Over a career spanning 5 decades, he received almost no recognition from Nashville's formal award structures. The man who helped write the Outlaw movement's founding document was kept permanently outside the door he had helped build. Number 6. Steve Earle. The weapon Nashville used against Steve Earle was the radio blacklist. After Guitar Town won the Grammy for Best Country Song in 1987 and made him one of the most talked about artists in the genre, MCA began to grow uncomfortable. Copperhead Road in 1988 pushed toward rock. His personal life became turbulent. By the early 1990s, country radio had quietly stopped playing his music, not through any official announcement, but through the invisible consensus the industry runs on. In 1994, MCA dropped him. No press release, no explanation, just silence. The machine simply closed the door. Number 5. Merle Haggard. The weapon used against Merle Haggard was his record. He had served time at San Quentin State Prison before his music career began, and certain radio stations and venues used that history as a quiet justification to limit his exposure in the early years. Nashville's establishment was never fully comfortable with a genuine ex-convict in their midst, regardless of his talent. When Haggard later criticized the Nashville sound openly, defended outlaw aesthetics, and refused to sanitize his image, the discomfort became active resistance. He won every battle, but Nashville made sure he earned every single inch. Number 4. Johnny Cash. The weapon Nashville used against Johnny Cash was one of the most breathtaking acts of institutional betrayal in the history of American music. In 1986, after 28 years, Columbia Records dropped him. The Man in Black, the most iconic figure country music had ever produced, was declared commercially finished and shown the door. No other major label moved in. Cash spent years in the wilderness, largely ignored by an industry he had defined. It took a rock producer named Rick Rubin and a series of deeply personal recordings on a small independent label to restore what Nashville had thrown away. When Unchained won the Grammy for Best Country Album in 1997, Cash took out a full-page ad in Billboard magazine, a photograph of himself giving the industry the finger. It remains the most eloquent response to a label drop in recorded history. Number 3. Willie Nelson. The weapon Nashville used against Willie Nelson was conformity. RCA signed him and spent years trying to turn him into a smooth, polished product of the Nashville sound. When his own compositions, songs like Crazy and Hello Walls, became hits for other artists, the label still couldn't see what they had in their hands. They wanted a different kind of record. Nelson wanted to make his music. When he couldn't do it in Nashville, he left. He headed to Austin, Texas, building his scene around venues like the Armadillo World Headquarters, where a different kind of country music was being allowed to breathe. He recorded what he wanted for Atlantic and then Columbia, and by the time he released Red-Headed Stranger in 1975, Nashville had no choice but to acknowledge what it had spent years trying to reshape into something more manageable. The machine never broke Willie Nelson. It just delayed him. Number 2. Waylon Jennings. The weapon Nashville used against Waylon Jennings was the recording studio itself. RCA Records controlled everything: his producers, his session musicians, his material, his sound. And standing at the center of that control was Chet Atkins, the architect of the Nashville sound, whose production philosophy shaped what RCA would and would not release. Jennings pushed back for years. He knew what he wanted to make. Nashville knew what it wanted to sell. The standoff broke in 1972 when Jennings negotiated one of the first fully independent production deals in country music history: the right to produce his own records, choose his own players, and record where and when he chose. By 1976, that independence had produced something the industry could not ignore: Wanted. The Outlaws, a compilation featuring Waylon, Willie Nelson, Jesse Coulter, and Tom Paul Glaser that became the first country album in history to be certified platinum. 1 million copies. Nashville had spent nearly a decade trying to manage Waylon Jennings into something smaller. He used that anger and that record to build something enormous. And audiences heard it everywhere, including in living rooms across America, tuning in to hear his voice on Good Ol' Boys, the theme to the Dukes of Hazzard, the biggest crossover moment outlaw country ever had. Number 1. David Allan Coe. The weapon Nashville used against David Allan Coe was total erasure. Not a single label drop, not a single radio ban, but all of it, simultaneously, for decades. Coe arrived in Nashville in the late 1960s, having spent most of his life inside the correctional system. His music was too dark, too explicit, and too honest for the establishment to accommodate. Columbia signed him but refused to promote the recordings that represented his real artistic identity. His most raw and confrontational albums were self-pressed and sold out of the back of a truck. Nashville's award bodies never nominated him. Country radio played almost none of his work. Yet the artists Nashville did promote, Tanya Tucker, Johnny Paycheck, Willie Nelson, recorded his songs and took them to the top of the charts. Coe wrote "You Never Even Called Me by My Name," which became country music's unofficial national anthem. He wrote "Take This Job and Shove It." He wrote songs that defined what this genre meant to working people across America. Nashville took the songs and buried the man who wrote them. David Allan Coe passed away on April 29, 2026. He was 86 years old. He never received a Grammy nomination. He was never inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame. The machine got what it wanted. History didn't. These 10 men didn't lose to Nashville. Nashville spent decades trying to make them lose, and the music they refused to abandon outlived every executive who came after them. The Outlaw era is the most studied, most respected chapter in country music history. The men in this countdown are the reason why. Nashville tried to erase them. What it erased instead was its own credibility. If you know someone who needs to hear these names, share this video. And if there's a legend we missed, drop them in the comments below. Because the list is longer than 10.